and you get to travel, like you said, and I can relate. We both travel a lot and go to a lot of places, and we see a lot of things, and we hear a lot of things. And I would say the meat and potatoes of today's concerns in the drug world stem in two directions. One is I don't want my dog alerting to marijuana, and then the other one is I need a dog to start alerting to or finding fentanyl. And there's a lot of, I would say, beliefs mixed in with some data. So let's delve into this a little bit. We'll go into the marijuana one first. Most, I think, have a pretty good understanding that trying to proof a dog off of marijuana in law enforcement, what people get wrapped up on is, can it be done, can it not be done? And in a simple answer, you can extinct things. But in the law enforcement world, where we have to meet a level of scrutiny and reliability, the handlers can't predict things their dogs will encounter in the field. And when reinforcement happens, especially to a previously known target, this is where the reliability comes into question. And I'll let you kind of expand upon that, and then I'll jump in on some of the science side of that. But talk about what you've dealt with and what you see and things like that.
That is a very common question that gets asked. I think that it's dog specific. Can you extinguish? I think certain dogs you can. The question, though, and I think this is where people get hinked up on, and that is, well, my dog, I can never say that my dog is 100%, that he's not going to. Well, that's true, but the question is that the standard? Right? The standard is probable cause.
Yeah.
Probable cause is a low standard. It means is there a fair probability that contraband or evidence of a crime will be present, right?
Yeah.
So when we're looking at that, like my question is, or my challenge back to the canine community is, can you extinguish the behavior on the marijuana to an acceptable reliability level at the probable cause? And I think in some dogs you could probably do that. Other dogs, there's no way that's going to happen. So it's very dog specific. But that is a common question that we get asked. And we see, in my opinion, we see a knee-jerk reaction to the change in the marijuana laws within different states. People getting rid of their dogs simply because they're marijuana dogs, even though their state hasn't even legalized marijuana yet. And I think it's a big knee-jerk reaction because if you look at the case law that is coming out, with a few exceptions, the majority of the courts have upheld marijuana-trained dogs in states that even have medical or legalized marijuana. Even so, if you look at, like, let's say California, the odor of marijuana to the officer is not probable cause. Illinois just came out with a similar case, People versus Stribling. The odor of marijuana to the officer, the human, is not probable cause.
Yeah.
But both states have upheld canine alerts where the dog were trained on marijuana. As a matter of fact, the Illinois, both of those cases came out in 2022, a week from each other.
Oh, wow.
One appellate court said the odor of marijuana to the officer is not probable cause. And then they went on to say the odor of marijuana or a dog alert, even if the dog is trained in marijuana, is still probable cause. Because the question is there a fair probability that contraband or evidence of a crime will be located in the area to be searched? So they said, well, even though the dog's trained in marijuana, and the California court said the exact same thing, the dog is also trained on cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, all of which are still unlawful to possess. And even marijuana, at a certain level, it becomes unlawful to possess. Nevada has upheld it. Arizona has upheld it. So I think when we look at this, it's a knee-jerk reaction. The only two states really that have come to opposite conclusions is Colorado, and People versus McKnight, People versus Gadbury. Both cases had nothing to do with marijuana. They were both methamphetamine cases, but because the dog was trained in marijuana. and then Oregon, but they did it in part. They said if you're over the age of 21, a marijuana-trained dog would not create probable cause. But if you're under 21, it may create probable cause because
It's illegal to possess at the age.
at that age, correct. So I just think it's a huge knee-jerk reaction. The other thing that we're seeing challenges as of recently in several of the state courts is where marijuana is not legal within the state, yet hemp or CBD is.
Okay.
And so defense attorneys are challenging the dog, saying, well, the dog is alerting to CBD or CBD, the dog is alerting to hemp. Those are legal substances, and therefore the dog may have alerted to a legal substance. And then their basis is if we look at Illinois versus Cabellas out of the Supreme Court, 2005, if you look at United States versus Place out of the Supreme Court, 1983, the Supreme Court was clear that it was a well-trained dog that would not expose non-contraband items. Well, of course, talking about marijuana or CBD or hemp, which may not be contraband items per se. But again, we go back to what the legal standard is, which is probable cause.
Yes.
Right? Is there a fair
Does the
probability?
probability exist? Right. Yeah.
And going on what you were saying about Dr. Furton down there at Florida International University, what I find really interesting when you look at some of these cases, and I'll give you an example, the state of North Carolina. While they were in the process of passing legislation for, it was either the CBD or the legalization of hemp, I can't remember which one, but the State Bureau of Investigations, SBI in North Carolina, issued a memorandum that said there is no difference between marijuana and hemp. There's no difference between marijuana and CBD, and they look alike, they smell alike, and on top of it, not only is it indistinguishable to the human officer, it's indistinguishable to the canine because the canine is alerting to THC. And we see that in case after case after case, handlers testifying that when their dog is alerting to marijuana odor, that the dog is alerting to THC. Well, my question back, as soon as and of course, who picked up on the State Bureau of Investigation North Carolina memo? The North Carolina Court of Appeals, because it was raised in several court cases now. And so, of course, that got picked up. And so I immediately tried to call SBI. I tried to email them to no avail. Nobody wanted to respond to me. I said, listen, all I want to know is point to some scientific peer-reviewed study that says that the dog is alerting to THC.
Yeah.
And as we've discussed, it does not exist. So we don't know.
Yeah.
And previewing the study that will be coming out of FIU, it sounds like it's in the process of being published right now. It's certainly, I think, a reasonable conclusion might be that THC is not what the dog is alerting to based on the information that Dr. Furton was presenting. And I'd love to hear his take on that, but based on the information, and we have been patiently awaiting, or maybe not so patiently awaiting, for that study to come out. I've been, because it's such a common question, and we see agency after agency after agency across this nation either just getting rid of marijuana dogs altogether, retiring them way before their time on this knee-jerk reaction, or they're just not training them on the marijuana odors. I was up in the state of Wisconsin teaching a seminar this past year, and we were having this discussion that, of course, came up, and I brought up the case law that if you look at, these are the courts that have upheld it, these are the courts that have rejected it, and I keep a list of those cases so that we can compare when people ask. Here they are. You can look. Look at all the states that have upheld state courts that have upheld. Look at the federal courts, even the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in United States versus Gray. There's another one out there recently that they said the odor, a marijuana trained dog is still probable cause.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this agency said, could you send us a list? And I said, listen, I will send you the list, but you need to discuss this with your local prosecutor, because ultimately, in the end, it's going to be up to the local prosecutor whether they want to pursue any litigation that would come as a result of a marijuana trained dog. And the district attorney actually in that area called me up and said, hey, I understand you have a list of cases. And I said, I do. And I'll send it to you. And Wisconsin is not a legalized marijuana state. The CBD is legal there. And so I sent him to her, and we were having this conversation. And she said, I'm very upset that this agency, she goes, I am the lead narcotic district attorney, assistant district attorney in this area. This agency never came to me in advance to purchasing these dogs and not training them on marijuana. That was all their decision. They never once came to me and asked what my opinion was.
Okay.
And so she looked at the cases, and we had this discussion, same discussion that we're having. She goes, Mike, I agree with you. I'm going to go back and tell them that I think they should add it on. If they can add on the marijuana odor, add it on, I think we can defend this easily. Even if the state legislature at some point or another legalize it. So, I mean, those are the discussions.
Well,
that we're having.
and you're bringing up what happens to our industry frequently is we're reactive. We freak out and become very reactive to something.
Do we have all the answers? No. When we're sitting here, these are the strong arguments, though, that need to be made. And then it's going to be up to the courts to determine whether these arguments are legally sound or legally valid or constitutional within that particular jurisdiction. But the local prosecutors have to be on board with that. They have to be willing to make the argument. But they're not going to make the argument if nobody walks into their office and has the conversation with them.
Correct.
And says, hey, we have... these are the issues. Here's the cases. They may not be jurisdictional. They may be persuasive cases, but are you willing to make the argument?
Yeah.
And you have these district attorneys. Some of them are like, yeah, we'll make this argument.
We'll fight this all day long. Other ones are like, if your dog's on marijuana, I don't want to touch it.
Yeah. And that's a different story, right?
And before I move into the next segment, I want to circle back to, can we get the dogs off of an odor? And like we said, you can attempt to extinguish a behavior, to say, hey, I don't want you to do your trained final response on this chemical. In this case, we'll say marijuana. However, what many don't consider is a psychological phenomenon called spontaneous recovery. And in an environment in which, in this case, the real world, marijuana would be present, but the absence of another odor isn't present, the dog's like, well, the handlers walked me by this area twice, maybe. Right. Dog threw a head change. Oh, there's their marijuana, but I don't want to alert. But the handler doesn't know that that's there, right? So now the handler sees this behavior, takes the dog back a second time. Now the dog, along with, well, this is happening, context generalization, handler's doing this stuff that's predictable to my reward. But in addition, the dog's like, this has paid me before. Spontaneous recovery. Okay, I'm going to alert.
Well, and that brings up another issue. I hope you don't mind me bringing it up.
Go right ahead.
So I don't want to take this direction you didn't want it to go. But the flip side of the coin is we have these dogs that are coming out non-trained, not trained on marijuana, on that odor, but then through their training or their experience on the street, they are, if you want to, self-imprinting on these odors. On both sides of these aisle, we need to be ensured that if the dog is not supposed to alert on marijuana, that we are proofing that on a regular basis in our training and being able to show that, because...
And do so blindly under numerous conditions that match the real world. And that's where we both agree that that doesn't happen. Like, we can barely get handlers to do normal training, let alone them apply a scientific protocol to bolster the fact that their dogs are reliable enough not to indicate to marijuana in a unknown circumstance. And most times, here's the part I'll agree with. The dog will do just fine. It's the handler who's going to overinterpret that interest that they don't know at that moment because they stopped that known, dirt bag on the, in their known drug areas that's known for meth mostly, right? But then in this case, as we all know, most drugs also accompany marijuana. Mm-hmm. So then the handler, again, can you say and this is where, again, some legal things would start to get thrown into it. Well, what did the dog alert to, the marijuana or the meth? And we're never going to know. And there's going to be arguments. But this is why I just say, don't even go down the path of trying to prove that you're taking your dog off marijuana, because you can't do it at a level that wouldn't face scrutiny and get torn apart pretty easily.
And I agree, because most handlers, as you said, are not going to they're not going to be willing to take the steps necessary.
The protocols that have to be followed.
And the protocols that have to be followed. And as you rightfully said, I mean, we can't even get handlers to do proper training to begin with. But then if you take that one step further, assuming that they are doing proper training, or at least proper training protocols, can they articulate that in their training records sufficiently?
Correct.
Which we know
is a crapshoot no matter where we're at.
It absolutely is.
Certain states, it's great. We can run across handlers that do amazing records, and you got ones that are told, do the bare minimum. You just write yes or no, positive, negative, some symbols, and that means that your dog did good or bad.
And I think that's where I would say, with a high degree of certainty, if that's the training that you're doing and that's the documentation that you have, then there should be no attempt probably to try to extinguish this, because there will be too many holes, and then without these sufficient basis to articulate that to a court, to a judge, that's when you're going to run into those problems. I mean, if you had a squared away handler, squared away training protocols, squared away articulation, and a dog that could do it.
Yep. And a chemist that works with you that sets these things up and knows the levels of what's there.
Exactly.
And there's again, this is that deeper into the weeds part. And I'll just throw one more layer that most don't consider. I mean, you talked about before going on the air, was the cognitive aspect. Is your dog a memory dog? Is your dog an inference dog? That higher memory dog is much harder to extinguish, much more likely to go into that spontaneous recovery to a previously known target. And most guys don't know, or handlers don't know that. They don't know if their dog is high memory or low memory, or high inference, low inference, things like that.
Well, and I think that's what, as we were talking prior to this, why what you're doing is so important. I mean, if I had known the canine cognition stuff years ago, when I'm not at the end of my career, not at the end of my dog's career, I want to know how my dog is learning, what their learning style is, so that I could, as you said, maximize my training, right? And I think some handlers, they don't want to know, or they feel like it's, as you said, it's more for the civilian side of things, but it's not. It's so important for you to know, so that you can really get the best results out of your training, and you can understand that. And I think that's why what you're doing is so important in my mind. And I just hope that the industry is listening, that this is important.
Every researcher I know will tell you this is what I know based on this testing criteria. This helps us form more ideas and hopes, but what I have to impart upon the audience who's listening and watching, don't freak out one way or the other about the results, whether it be a case law, whether it be a scientific study. We need to take in some things, because like you point out on the legal side of things, certain things from a certain district court, it may not even be applicable to all the other districts,
right?
But what happens is people hop on the internet, get on a law enforcement Facebook group and go, oh my God, did you see the results of this? We're now no longer doing X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. And then there'd be 20 more going, F you, this is why you know. So try to share with those that are willing to listen. Take a pause. Read what's being said. Is it truly applicable? And if so, take those things away. If there's some stuff that's valuable, let some time pass. You know, let's see where this starts to shake out.
Exactly.
Let's have conversations like we're doing and see where this goes. But we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, knee-jerk reactions, because those are also as unpredictable or unreliable or unnecessary,
I agree,
depending on the circumstances, to solving the problem either.
Right.
You know?
Well, and I agree. And just in this very narrow topic of marijuana, I mean, you can apply this to many different things, but just in this narrow topic of marijuana, you know, okay, so we're not going to get a marijuana trained dog, right? Okay, well, does your agency know, or do you know the protocols to ensure that that dog is, as time goes on, not going to self-imprint, if you will, or, you know, and how are you going to go about that? And where, you know, they could go down a whole nother path. Well, where were your the training aids that you're using? Where were they stored? Were they stored in with marijuana? Were they stored with you know, in some evidence room that had, you know, 300 pounds of marijuana? Is it sitting sitting next to marijuana? And I mean, these are things that all this stuff needs to come into play. And how are we going to do? If this is the path we want to go, great. What are the proper protocols to ensure that that is occurring?
And can the agency meet those protocols?
Well,
that's where the rubber meets the road many times, because you know, the agency that has 40 officers in it and gets minimal support or logistical support, like getting training aids and how to properly doing it. Well, I train with Jim Bob, and he just throws his stuff in a canvas bag and tosses it in his ammo can. It's perfectly fine. And then the other ones are following, like what Dr. DeGrief would show you, putting it in a, you know, glass jar that's tinted to keep UV light out of it, and you know, so it is nice that we're starting to see more standardized information be shared. But man, it's going to take a while for it to kind of like filter through everything. And I hope things like the podcast and videos and research papers and so forth help continue to spread that word.